professor 这个很多呀，给路线，那我哋有 B， hay do phần cỏ, khúc cỏ, đó chỉ của còn là hay lù đồ này vấn đề nữa, là một bìa cho mình có gì cho chú chi thì tao tao một trả thế, professor 这个每天是早起起哦，你 study Hmong language and culture for 到你能够上nó là nó. Nếu một thái đến rồi tới một khá là cũng cho phim một cho kiểu nó ngoài dài cho pli xuôi giả nếu thái đến rồi tới nhá là tới xuân tới phát kỳ tới nếu như một khá là tao đó chỉ để cho để đảm một khá là tao đó nhưng chỉ tao mới cho trở liệu mới cho thế trở liệu một hai tao đâu có chỉ cho thế nào vậy chỉ hơn người thiết tua hay thế này có chỉ cho mình nhiều chỉ có chỉ mấy đứa nên nhà đá để chứng à cái nên nhà này chỉ liệu có ta phải cái này hả bây giờ không mà tôi ấy chẳng lo tua mà cho nên có niềm á cho tụi thế chân đạo sao I'm impressed in chân đạo để thầu của tôi cả họ nói thế này là cái bế chuối xí hỏi cái bế chuối ít mỏi của thả ra nên mình này ok first time thầu ý xe thầu ốp hạ cầu để của tôi khen được là sinh khí tại của nó có gì mà I remember lá lẩu thế nuôi gì cái này rồi cái lò mà cái gì chả hai bữa cuối cái chơi qua thì nó phải thế hả? Yeah. So có gì cho nào là mà tao hình thức có gì mà you pick and choose the people you teach. So you mua a lot of you mua cho testing này rồi you muaอยู่สี่เชือกก็จะมันมาแค่cho nào là cho you. Chỉ có gì hay đâu cũng hay tiền còn này sao tu sửa Don't be ashamed hay tiền này chỉ tao có gì cho chú gì nè lúc họ cho nó như này chỉ tiền đó là chơi như này chỉ chơi nó có gì hay đâu của lý do đã chỉ năng hay thằng có gì nhau khổ mà thì nên need to come back tôi không mới tôi cần nó rồi rồi chỉ bảo thì học cụ thế nào rồi cái story nó mà cụ chỉ bảo thì nên thả lên đấy thế này rồi thì thằng nhau khổ mà thằng người sinh đã lo mà nên thì你最后你知道点 ，OK， because 因为对面都有多个，你就叫主机，佢叫主機呢，佢知道個嘅人，我對你多嘅，現在就只能保你嘅呢三項物件來進行了呀 ，OK， 所以可能就帶有 coincident 嘅，佢只保嘅佢頭嗰個嘢 discipline 啦，佢一直到晒嘅，要到下到呢年 ，OK， 個學咗 discipline 佢做個佢保姆 analyze 保姆 interpret 一到這個呢同 student 弄故事啦。hay để cho pli vì trả cho pli thế ông trả sư tức là cái tao gì xóa nhau này chỉ có tôi hay tôi này là chỉ bao chỉ phần đàn này hết cái thì cái sai pli là bây giờ chỉ hay tao block cho xong rồi chỉ muốn nên nói là người hay người này bỏ hoàn toàn hay thì người hay giáo chỉ trong người cho bé hay thao rồi chỉ có chỉ cho chú chỉ trong đó tôi sẽ hướng dẫn cho cái thế đó là của cho tôi professor cho cái hết mình làm hay ulumega nó này chỉ cho tao luôn không ạ nữ thầu cũng một cần tới rồi nữa nữ trai cũng một cần tới đó nữa nè ta sẽ giờ không kể trai chỉ với nữ tu sĩ hữu ta sẽ để cao trên nữ của tu sĩ hữu là hay rồi ok so nên nữ cần được cuối thiệt ok so
nhớ rồi nên là cô chỉ cho ra hay là mong đó mà cô là hay là rõ ok thật sự là này đó mà sự việc gia đình tu hay cho cô hay phải làm video call chỉ video call cô yang hong ta mà ya video call cô ya itu tin anh sang rồi tôi này so I'm going to speak English because I think the reason that Sophia Yaking wanted me to come and say a few words is probably not for the older generation but for the younger generation because I came to study all of these rituals and Hmong culture as an outsider, and I feel like some of you younger people sometimes maybe you feel a little bit like an outsider. Maybe you don't understand all the different things that are being said and sung. Is that fair? You young people, yeah? So, I mean, that's basically my perspective in coming to study Hmong culture. When I first met a Hmong family in Alaska 20 years ago, I knew nothing about Hmong culture. I remember them taking me to a Woning ceremony, and it blew my mind. I'd never seen anything like it. And it's Hmong people who made me want to study anthropology. If I hadn't made those Hmong friends, I probably wouldn't have a PhD and be a university professor because it was my Hmong friends who made me be interested in trying to study culture and wanting to get a PhD so I could spend my life basically devoted to researching other people's cultures, and most specifically Hmong culture. So I think, yeah, Gang wanted me to maybe give you a little bit of my perspective as an outsider studying it, to help the younger people sort of think about why this is important. So this ritual, the Zisai, it was one of the first things. So I've lived in Hmong communities in Thailand for 2 years, China for a year, Vietnam for about 6 months. I've lived with Hmong communities in France and the US for long periods of time. And when I first went to Thailand, to live in a Hmong village in Thailand, I told people I wanted to understand, like, how Hmong people believe that about their moral beliefs, like what they think is good in life and everything that's most important. Like, I wanted to understand the values of Hmong society. And one of my friends said, "Oh, you have to go to a funeral. You have to go listen to the Zisai, because the Zisai has all of this knowledge from your ancestors, hundreds of years of knowledge passed down from generation to generation. It has those ideas in it." And I think it's really important for specifically younger people to really understand what they're saying to you, because sometimes, is it fair, they say difficult words that we don't always understand? And some of these, I'm talking to you younger people, is that true? Sometimes they say things we don't understand, yeah? And so me, as basically like a 3-year-old with regards to Hmong culture, I was trying to understand some of these basic ideas. And the Zisai really encapsulates so much of Hmong understanding of the world. And I have a bunch of notes here. I don't think I need to actually go through all of it. But there's kind of three major parts. The first part is the kipia. That's the sort of opening and the introduction. There's a lot of formalities there. You're inviting the person's soul to come, grandma's soul in this case, to come and sort of be part of it. You're calling the descendants to come and to do their role and to pay their respects to grandma or mom or auntie or whatever it may be. And then they, tell us kind of some of the rules of what we're supposed to do. The second major phase of that Zisai is the qhuas. And that was where they were kind of sitting around the table and talking about the different things. But that's it's almost like a courtroom, right? They're trying to make sure that everything in that person's life is sort of like settled, that there's nothing, that everything's good, so that they can sort of like settle any remaining issues and allow them to go on to their journey in the afterlife without any sort of like things pulling them back because they're not resolved, if that makes sense. And that's a very important part. And then the third phase is really kind of, it's a celebration of the person's life. So they talk about the cows. You saw the meat that was chopped up out there, right? You young people, right? They talked about the cows that are sacrificed. And if you really understand that, you realize that that's like one of the most powerful, important things, that the descendants can offer. Everybody sort of contribute to one of those cows being sacrificed for your mom or your grandmother or your auntie. And it's showing just how much you love them and how much you want them to have those things that they need that make us successful and healthy in this life, to show them that you want to give those things to them, make sacrifices for them so they can have it in the next life. And, without going through all of that last part, it ends with something called the phone call. And that's what Sifu Yakeng is starting right now. And this is just one of the most important things, because it kind of does two things. This was that thing that my friend in Thailand told me I really need to pay attention to. Because the two major parts of the phone call, it has a bunch of different things. But on the one hand, it's kind of like a lecture to the descendants. It's helping you remember your mother, your father, they took care of you. When you were a baby, you didn't know how to eat. They helped you eat. You didn't know how to survive. You didn't know how to do anything. They taught you all these things. But they also taught you work hard if you want to be successful. Study hard if you want to be good in school. Don't lie, don't cheat. Do good things. Be a good person. So it's sort of all that basic knowledge that you learn through life. You're being reminded that that's what your mother taught you, right? And then it's followed with some of the most powerful blessings you could ever receive. If you really think about it, this is the first time, I mean, your mother blessed you all throughout your life, but now you have the opportunity to receive the first blessings from her as an ancestor. And that's something that's really quite powerful. And so for you young kids, this is the first time that grandma gets to give you a blessing as an ancestor, and that's really powerful. When I was in a Hmong community in France, it was really sad. I was at a funeral, and I understood, unfortunately, more than what even a lot of the teenagers, young Hmong teenagers in the room understood. And I was just, trying to have a conversation with this young Hmong lady, a young Hmong woman in France. She was probably about 15, 16. And I was like, they were doing the phone call, and they were supposed to be sitting on the carpet just like this. And I just asked her, I was like, do you understand what they're doing right now? And she said, like, I don't know, is it a shaman ceremony, right? Because she really didn't understand the most basic thing, and that really kind of broke my heart, because that was the very moment where they were doing the phone call, right? And it was her grandmother that had passed away, and she wasn't understanding these powerful blessings that her grandma was sending to her as an ancestor for the very first time. And so I think that's one of the reasons that Sifu Yaking wanted me to say a couple of words about this, to help you young people particularly realize what's happening right now and how powerful and how important it is. Because I'm still an outsider. Maybe I started as a 3-year-old man, maybe now I'm just a 4 or a 5-year-old with regards to Hmong culture. But I think that maybe helps me speak to some of you young people who have a hard time understanding these things sometimes. Is that fair? You little guys? Yeah? So let me just kind of conclude with a couple of thoughts about this. So that's my perspective on kind of why these things are so important. It really, these are some of the most central and important and powerful ideas in Hmong culture, and that's why funerals are so important, because it's really where you pass that knowledge from one generation down to the next, and you have the opportunity to actually receive blessings from it. And I guess I want to say a couple of things specifically about Master Shunzi and your grandfather. So Yaking and I are, so yes, he's my master's student. He came to study anthropology with me, but I think I spend more time studying Hmong culture with him as my sifu, right? And so it's very interesting when, both students can call the other person, professor or sifu, right? But we're doing a project together where we're basically trying to analyze the ideas of your grandfather, of Master Shunzi, as a philosophy, as a theory, not just a theory of Hmong culture, but a theory of human experience. So my area of study, I'm an anthropologist. So my PhD is in anthropology. And anthropology is basically the study of humanity, the study of cultures and so on. And anthropologists write all these big long books, and they make all these ideas where they're trying to understand why different cultures are different and why life is the way it is, right? That's what anthropology as an academic field tries to do. And universities spend millions and millions of dollars on these departments and paying faculty like myself to write these ideas. But I guess I just want to point out, in our society we tend to value the written word. We tend to value books. We think of books as like the sources of knowledge. But I think it's really important for you young people to understand something that's just critical about Hmong culture. While, for example, Master Shunzi may not have written the book of all these rituals, the way that he had to learn them and pass them on, I would argue actually requires a higher degree of intelligence and skill and study than frankly it does to write a book or to read a book and write about that book. Because you have to spend hours and hours and hours. I mean, do you see any of these guys reading the songs that they're singing? Because I can tell you, I try and listen real hard and I still don't understand all of it, but they're not repeating themselves over and over and over. Each verse is a distinct verse and you have to memorize all of that. And for such a long time, Hmong masters have been going through this very difficult, painstaking process of learning all of these rituals to be able to chant for hours, literally all night. And that requires such a high degree of intelligence and study. And I guess the other thing that's interesting about Master Shunzi is that he didn't just memorize and learn those rituals. But he tried to put them together and understand the ideas behind them and develop a whole philosophy and a whole theory of human experience from that. And in that sense, basically the project that Yaging and I are trying to do is to try and sort of elevate those ideas to the same level as, any philosopher or theorist in philosophy, psychology, and anthropology, because at the end of the day, these ideas are just as fundamental. They're just as insightful for the things that all of us university professors care about in understanding what it means to be human. And so that's what we're trying to do, and it really kind of starts with Master Shongzar because he was one of the most learned scholars of this Hmong philosophical tradition. Yaging feels quite strongly, and I agree with him, that this is not a coincidence that we happen to be working together on this project at this time. Master Shongzar told Yaging that he was training him, as he was training him, that one of his wishes was for Yaging to be able to share this knowledge, not just first with his descendants, and then with the Hmong community, and even more broadly with the world. And the fact that Yaging is performing Master Shongzar's version of this Tsai for the first time in its entirety tonight for your own mother is quite significant and poetic. Because, given the circumstances and the fact that your mother and grandma and auntie passed away during the pandemic, she couldn't receive a full funeral. And this ritual, this version that is being performed really for the first time, I think in probably 30 or 40 years, right? The version that your grandfather and father, preserved, that he got from another master, who got from a master before that. It's really being performed for the first time in 30 to 40 years tonight for your own mom and grandma and auntie. And that really is quite powerful. And I guess I just want to say one last thought, and that is that if you really think about it, the reason it hasn't been performed for 30 or 40 years is because what this version does is it's able to take a situation where the person didn't have a full funeral when they passed away, and to be able to basically combine it with the Jopli, bring that person back, and provide them with all of the blessings and the spiritual care, the sacrifices, and everything that the descendants really want to give to their mother, their auntie, their grandma, to provide for her in the afterlife. This version of the ritual really has the ability to do that. If you think about it, it's interesting because the COVID-19 pandemic has hit the Hmong community particularly hard, and in more ways than one. On the one hand, there's the vulnerability of the older generation, but on top of that, during all these lockdowns, we weren't able to do proper funerals for all the people that passed away during that time and provide all that spiritual care that they need to receive so that they can move on in their afterlife. And if we think for a second about Hmong history, Hmong American history, this is kind of a mirror image of the double trauma that Hmong people experienced when they had to flee Laos. When you had to flee Laos and some people didn't make it, some people died in the jungle, they weren't able to receive a proper funeral. And this very ritual being performed tonight was performed extensively in the refugee camps and even once people first came to the United States because they weren't able to receive a proper funeral when they died. So you needed all this specialist knowledge that's been preserved so that it could be performed for them and still provide for them in the way that you would provide for them were you able to do a regular funeral. And so the last time that we really had this happening on a large scale like this was when Hmong first left Laos. And now with the pandemic and all these people who have passed away without being able to receive proper funerals, it's happening again. And I guess, you can think of that in a negative light, but I think that there's, despite the difficulty of these times, in the mirror of the difficulty of times past when Hmong families had to flee Laos, there's something beautiful and even triumphant about the fact that this ritual knowledge has been preserved. It's been passed down, and now it's being used once again to help overcome these recent difficulties and help your mother find peace, which will better enable you, her descendants, to find peace. And when Hmong people overcame And if you think about Hmong history, they overcame it many times before even, right? You know, if you really listen to the history, it's going back to fighting the Chinese and, you know, then the French colonists and then the Secret War and now the pandemic. But once again, your community is able to overcome. And specifically because Master Shongzhi worked so hard as a scholar and a philosopher of Hmong culture and Hmong history and Hmong ideas, and was able to pass that down to Yakeng, who can now perform that very knowledge that your father and grandfather and uncle were able to preserve and pass down, so that once again, your family and your community can overcome. And I think there's just something absolutely amazing and beautiful about that. And it just makes me even more excited to continue learning so that maybe I can graduate to being a 7 or an 8-year-old with regards to Hmong culture.
You want to talk a little bit about the 3 song?
Oh. I don't know how much you want me to say about this.
Especially you.
So
Understand.
yeah, I think I think one of the basic ideas that Yakeng and I are trying to, we've actually presented a paper on this, and we're going to present some other papers to academic conferences, to anthropology and Asian studies conferences. But it really has to do with the idea about basically a Hmong theory of what is a person, right? And I actually, one of my hobbies in going around to Hmong communities is asking different people of different, men, women, old people, young people, ritual specialists, not ritual non-specialists, basically to ask them, how many how many spirits does a person have? And I would get, I wonder actually we won't take a poll, but sometimes we would say, right? One person must just have one soul. Or some people are like, or somebody would say, like 1, 3, 365, 32. Like these numbers would be all over the place. But one of the things that your father and grandfather did was, once again, not just learning the rituals, but learning the rituals and the ideas behind them. And he developed, I think, what you could call a Hmong theology, right? In other words, a systematic set of ideas that answered these deep questions about the nature of the universe. And Master Shongzhi's answer to this question is, it's quite clearly that they're so there's the Juzhang Juncha, which is basically your sort of, it's the soul that is your ancestral heritage, right? You could call it the genetic soul or the ancestral soul. And the different rituals speak to different, Jupli, right? So for example, the Jatagay, when somebody passes away, they narrate their life in reverse and kind of give them all the knowledge they need to receive to return to the ancestors. That's the Juzhang Juncha, right? And then the second one is the Jushin Juzhao, which is the sort of vital soul or the life soul. And that's the one that is reincarnated, right? And so, it's an interesting question. You ask Hmong people, do you believe in reincarnation? Yes. Do you believe that people go back to live with their ancestors forever? Yes. Like, how do those two things work together? Well, Master Shongzhi found an answer to that question, and quite definitively through his extensive knowledge of all of these rituals. And then the third was the Jushin Jundong, or the shelter or the support soul. So this is the one that goes to the grave. It's the object of rituals like the Jopli, for example, or the Laida. That you're doing that to one of the souls of the person. That's specifically the Jushin Jundong. And if you understand sort of these different elements of the person, then a human being is sort of made up of these sort of like different elements. And there are a lot of different theories about what a person is. But part of what we're trying to do is sort of take Master Shongzhi's ideas and put those into dialogue with these other scholarly and theological ideas about what a person is, so that because we think that his knowledge needs to be part of that canon that helps scholars and philosophers understand better the human condition and human experience. That's probably all I need to say about that now. So.
Because that's knowledge, and I'm not saying that we're not saying that message from the are the best Hmong culture expert out there, but we're saying that your stomach the most sense. So, hôm nay ít khỏi toàn đây là chỉ nên chỉ nên giải tua là nên giúp bị chỉ tua nên nhà nên giải tua là nên sau công dân chỉ tua nữa, cái thì nhớ tờ library nhớ đâu nhiều cần đỡ nhớ gì toàn đây là nên chỉ nhiều nên dùng tờ sân bên thì nó tất cả tôi một cái nên chỉ cho idea, cái đó là cái nên chỉ nên nữa, cái số cho một professor Jacob mong thời gian sẽ ở bán nên mong thời gian sẽ nào, cái là nu chỉ nên chỉ nhiều là đã một là PhD lúc nào ít được cho họ chữ mẹ thì bữa còn là muốn chữ mẹ đâu họ hiện những muốn chữ mẹ đó này thì còn nên ta nên giờ sinh lăng sinh dự ta doctor số tu đi doctor hết mình nó, ok, được nào.